Good to see you in a new video on Betrayal Wife Tales. Today I'm going to tell you an interesting story of our subscriber.
I've come across many stories, and a lot of them have a kind of heart-wrenching sadness that sticks with you. Some of those stories really get under your skin, the bitterness and betrayal leaping off the page. I don't know if I can evoke that same intensity in my story, but it's still a tale of loss. It's not quite as sharp as some of the others, but maybe it offers something different. A reminder that time and a little patience can help heal even the deepest wounds. It's strange to even think about these events now. So much time has passed. Why am I writing this? Maybe it's to show that good things can eventually emerge even after you've been broken down to your lowest point. Or maybe I just want to tell my story. One that still feels relevant despite the years that have gone by. Time has a funny way of dulling the edges of pain, doesn't it? I'll admit, this might get long-winded, but the background is important. It sets the stage for everything that came after. And here's where I need your advice, your perspective. Is it crazy to even think about starting over? At my age, 60, it feels like a gamble, one I'm not sure is worth taking. I met my wife Allison over 20 years ago. We were together for nearly 10 years, with 7 of those spent married. Together we had 2 kids, both of whom are now fully grown and living their own lives. Funny enough, we met on a blind date, and let's just say the whole night was awkward. Allison was strikingly beautiful, full of life, with a contagious energy that drew people in. Me? Well, I've always been on the quieter side. I wouldn't call myself unattractive, but I'm far from the guy that turns heads when I walk into a room. I'm just normal. Allison had a way of lighting up a space, with her laugh, her kindness. She was always the one people gravitated toward, while I tended to blend into the background. Still, despite our differences, she took an interest in me, and for reasons I couldn't quite grasp at the time, our relationship blossomed. Eventually, we got married. Life was good, really good, actually. We had a nice home, steady finances, families who supported us, and a circle of friends that made us feel fortunate. Our kids were thriving. On the surface, everything looked perfect. But as with so many of these stories, there's always a moment when everything shifts, when things fall apart. For us, that moment came with a 3rd pregnancy. We already had our 2 kids and wanted a 3rd. Why not, right? Our family was happy, so adding another child seemed like the perfect way to make things even better. We didn't have any trouble conceiving, and soon enough, Allison was pregnant. I was thrilled when she told me the news. We waited a few months before sharing it with our families, and in those early days, we were busy preparing, planning for a nursery, discussing the future with the kids, balancing finances. Then, out of nowhere, everything changed. I still remember the day Allison called me. Her voice was shaky as she said, "Something's wrong." My heart sank. We rushed to the hospital, hoping for the best, but the universe had other plans. Allison lost the baby at 6 months. It was devastating, a punch to the gut that neither of us saw coming. The drive home the next day was cloaked in silence, the weight of loss suffocating us. Allison disappeared into the bedroom that night and didn't come out for days. She was drowning in grief, convinced she had failed as a wife, as a mother. No matter how many times I told her it wasn't her fault, that this was out of our control, she couldn't hear me. She carried that weight alone, sinking deeper into a dark depression. It took months for her to pull herself out of it. Slowly, she seemed to come back to life. She was more present with the kids again, and we even started talking about the future, what it might look like now. She started taking better care of herself, exercising more, getting back into shape. She looked incredible, and I loved reminding her of that. I made sure to tell her how much I adored her, how much she meant to me. For a while, it felt like things were returning to normal. One day, she mentioned wanting to get a part-time job. It wasn't about the money. She just needed something to do, a way to escape the house and engage with the world again. I thought it was a great idea and told her to go for it. I figured she'd look for something that suited her degree in business, but to my surprise, she took a job as a waitress and bartender at a local restaurant just down the road from us. At first, it didn't make much sense to me. Why work in a restaurant when she had a degree? But she explained it was about the flexibility. A corporate job would demand too much, and this way she could stay connected to home and the kids. Plus, she needed to talk to adults again, to feel part of something outside of the family. I understood and supported her all the way. Now, it's worth mentioning again, Allison is a beautiful woman, and after months of getting in shape and focusing on herself, she was absolutely stunning. She has always attracted attention from men, but I never worried about it. She was loyal and I trusted her completely. Or at least, I thought I did. Allison started her new job, and for a while, everything seemed to be going fine. She worked a couple of nights a week, mostly Fridays and Saturdays. I'll admit, I wasn't entirely comfortable with some of the outfits she wore to work. They weren't inappropriate, but they definitely highlighted her figure more than I was used to seeing her show off. It's not like I didn't appreciate how good she looked. She was stunning. But part of me wished she'd dress a little more conservatively, especially when she was heading into a place full of strangers. Whenever I mentioned it, she'd just laugh and tease me, saying it was all part of getting better tips. She even joked that maybe her outfits would spark a little more romantic interest from me. I'd smile, but I wasn't really laughing. The restaurant she worked at was run by a decent guy, Greg, who had built a solid business. He was fair to his employees, and it was a family affair. His wife and kids worked there, too. His son, on the other hand, was a different story. Jackson, Greg's son, was the kind of guy who'd been handed everything on a silver platter. I could see it the moment I met him. He oozed arrogance, the type of confidence that comes from never really having to work for anything in life. He flaunted his wealth, his flashy car, his muscles from endless hours at the gym, and his conquests with women, which he never hesitated to brag about. He was around Allison's age and, I'll admit, a good-looking guy. Tall, broad-shouldered, the kind of man who turns heads. He was married, though he and his wife didn't have kids yet. His wife, Sophie, was sweet, kind. Honestly, too good for him. She helped manage the restaurant's finances while Jackson was supposed to handle catering and special events. But from what I heard, he barely lifted a finger, dumping his responsibilities on others whenever he could. I never liked Jackson. From the first time I met him, I could tell he was a loudmouth, a man full of himself with no real substance. Allison mentioned a few times how attractive he was, though she'd always follow it up by calling him an arrogant jerk. She couldn't stand his attitude but had no choice but to work alongside him, so she kept her feelings to herself. At least, that's what I thought. Over the next few months, things started to feel off. Allison's behavior changed in subtle, unsettling ways. She was glued to her phone, always checking her messages or slipping off to make calls when she thought I wasn't looking. She began coming home later than usual, saying the restaurant was busy or that she'd stayed to help clean up after closing. And she'd disappear for hours during the day, claiming she was running errands or shopping, but nothing about it felt right. She was more distant, too, not just from me, but from the kids. Allison had always been a devoted mother, but now she seemed distracted, almost impatient with them. She handed over more and more of the parenting duties to me, which wasn't easy since I worked full-time and was the primary provider for our family. When I asked her what was going on, she brushed me off, insisting that everything was fine and that I was imagining things. Then came the night that changed everything. It was late, just the two of us at home. I reached for her, thinking we could reconnect in the way couples do, but she pulled away. Cold, distant. Something in her eyes told me this wasn't just a bad night or a passing mood. I asked her what was wrong, and to my shock, she started crying, her whole body trembling as she tried to form the words. My heart pounded in my chest, an uneasy dread crawling through me. Finally, she looked up at me, tears streaming down her face, and said words that hit me like a sledgehammer. "I've been seeing Jackson." I stared at her, dumbfounded, not sure I had heard her right. "What?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, praying I was mistaken. She wiped her eyes, trying to steady herself, but the next words shattered any hope I had left. "It's been going on for almost 6 months. I didn't want it to happen, but it did. We've been sleeping together. I love him, Nick. I'm sorry, but we're done. I'm leaving you." I felt the ground beneath me shift, the world collapsing around me in a way I never imagined possible. "You love him?" I asked, my voice cracking. "What about us? What about our family?" She shook her head, unable to look me in the eye. "Something in me changed after the miscarriage. I've been miserable for months, Nick. I tried to keep it together, but something between us died that day. I need a fresh start. Jackson, he makes me feel alive again." I was stunned. She was talking about this man, this shallow, arrogant man, as if he were her salvation. I pleaded with her to reconsider, to think about our children, our life together. But her mind was made up. She had already found an apartment with him and planned to move in soon. The thought of her leaving to be with him, it was unbearable. But the worst part was when she told me she wanted the kids to stay with me, to maintain some stability for them in our family home. She'd still be there to see them, she said, but her life would now revolve around Jackson. I was absolutely floored. I could barely comprehend how we'd gone from a happy family to this. I asked her how she could even think of leaving us for a man like him. She tried to explain, saying she thought I had noticed her unhappiness long before this, and that the miscarriage had been the final nail in the coffin for our marriage. Hearing that she had been with Jackson for 6 months, behind my back, in secret, was like a knife twisting in my gut. They hadn't just been sneaking around, they'd been meeting up in his car, at hotels, and even at our own home when no one else was there. The betrayal was deep, and the hurt was immeasurable. How had I been so blind? How had I missed this? But somehow, in that moment of devastation, I managed to keep my cool. I didn't scream, didn't lose control. I just stood there trying to wrap my head around how my life had unraveled so completely, so quickly. The weeks that followed were some of the darkest of my life. A whirlwind of tears, desperate conversations, and the weight of sadness pressing down on every moment. My family, especially my dad, was furious. He wasted no time unleashing his anger at Allison, calling her every name in the book. He saw her as a betrayer, someone who had broken our family apart, and he didn't hold back. His words were like daggers, sharp and full of venom. As much as I was hurt, I knew I couldn't let things spiral into a pit of hate. I had to intervene. "She's still the mother of your grandchildren," I told him one evening after a particularly vicious rant. "Whatever she did to me, we still have to respect her for that. This isn't about revenge, Dad. It's about our family. I need her in our kids' lives, and they need her to still be their mom, even if things have changed." To my surprise, he listened. He saw how serious I was about keeping things civil for the sake of the children, and though it was clear he didn't agree, he backed off. He even complimented me on how I was handling the situation, telling me he couldn't imagine keeping his composure if he were in my shoes. It felt strange, receiving praise when my whole life was falling apart. I wanted to scream, to rage, to curse the world and Allison for what she had done, but I kept reminding myself that revenge wouldn't get me anywhere. She was the mother of my kids, and no matter how deeply she had wounded me, I couldn't let that destroy the one thing that still mattered: their sense of stability. Don't get me wrong. There were days when I fantasized about being the world's biggest jerk in response. But after thinking long and hard, I made my choice. I would take the high road. Eventually, Allison moved out and into the apartment she had found with Jackson. I watched her drive away that day, her car loaded with boxes, and it felt like she was ripping the last piece of our old life from my chest. She came by regularly to see the kids, though. At least she didn't vanish from their lives. I saw the pain in her eyes when she'd see them, the regret that lingered just beneath the surface. But it was clear she had made her decision and wasn't looking back. As for Jackson's wife, Sophie, I couldn't help but feel terrible for her. She had been blindsided by all of this, and she had to endure the humiliation of it in front of the whole community. Eventually, she left the restaurant, moved back to Pennsylvania, and filed for divorce. I'd see her occasionally at the grocery store before she left town, and every time I'd offer a quick nod, wishing her nothing but the best. From what I've heard, she's doing well now, remarried to a good man, with a family of her own. Honestly, that's probably the best thing that could have happened to her. Losing Jackson was her greatest stroke of luck, though I doubt she saw it that way at the time. The divorce itself was almost too smooth. We divided our assets, and Allison got a chunk of money, nothing outrageous, but enough to help her get on her feet. I agreed to pay alimony for 6 months, though, honestly, I would have paid just about anything to be free of the whole mess. Financial freedom felt like a small price to pay to escape the emotional devastation. We worked out joint custody, and I became the primary parent. She had visitation rights, and I made it clear that she was always welcome to see the kids. Despite everything, I still wanted her to be involved in their lives for their sake. Every now and then, when she'd come by to pick up the kids, I thought I saw something in her eyes, a flicker of something. Regret. Longing. Or maybe it was just my imagination, wishing there was some part of her that still felt a connection to the life we had built together. She didn't make much money, but she made sure to pay her child support on time, and I gave her credit for that. I could tell she was trying, even if things had fallen apart. Looking back, it's clear to me that the miscarriage broke something in her, maybe in both of us. I'm no saint, but I refuse to believe the Allison I married, the woman I knew before all of this, would have thrown away our family for a guy like Jackson if she had been in her right mind. But I was powerless to stop the spiral. It was like watching a slow-motion car crash, knowing there was nothing I could do to steer us off course. The day we finalized the divorce was surreal. We met at her lawyer's office, and I was struck by how at ease she seemed. She wasn't somber or reflective like I had expected. She was almost happy. She sat there next to Jackson, who had the nerve to show up with her, as if this was some grand victory for them both. It felt like a slap in the face, seeing them together. I had braced myself for the sadness, but seeing her look so content, almost giddy, hit me harder than I thought it would. The only time she faltered was when I spoke. I had been thinking about what I wanted to say for weeks. I'd even written it down and rehearsed it, determined to walk away with some dignity, with the last word. As I signed the final papers, I looked her in the eye and delivered my speech. "I'm sad this is how things ended," I began, my voice steady, though my heart was pounding. "I thought we had a good life together. We were a team. I'm sorry if you felt I let you down, if you thought I couldn't give you the happiness you needed. I can't pretend to understand all the reasons why this happened, but I do believe the miscarriage changed something for us. Tragedies like that, they either bring people closer together or tear them apart. I guess for us it was the latter." I paused, watching her face, trying to read her expression. She seemed taken aback, almost like she hadn't expected me to say anything at all. "But it's done now. All I want is for you to find the happiness you're searching for. And I hope we can work together to give our kids the best life possible. That's all that matters now." I could see something flicker across her face, a brief moment of shock, maybe even guilt, but it was gone just as quickly as it came. She looked away, back toward Jackson, and I knew that was it. Whatever connection we once had was truly gone. The room fell into an eerie silence after I finished my speech. Allison's face went pale, and in that brief moment, I saw it. Regret. But it was fleeting, as if she quickly realized the life she had chosen, the one sitting beside her. I stood up, reached out to shake her hand, and wished her well. "Goodbye," I said, with a finality that lingered. Her lawyer promised to send me a copy of the finalized divorce papers, but that wasn't the weight on my mind. It was the strange feeling that, despite everything, this chapter of my life had truly closed. At first, things seemed to settle into some form of normalcy. Allison was living with Jackson, the guy she had left me for, and while I'd heard bits and pieces about their new life together, I didn't pry. I just kept my focus on the kids and my own routine. I couldn't avoid the restaurant forever, though. I still ordered takeout from time to time. The owner, Jackson's father, always greeted me awkwardly when I came by. There was this air of embarrassment about him, especially since his son had not only wrecked his marriage, but was now playing house with my ex-wife. The owner was a family man, and one day, after a bit of small talk, he confided in me. "I don't know where I went wrong with him," he admitted. His face was drawn, tired from years of disappointment. I didn't have much to say to that. It wasn't my place to tell him how to feel about his own son, but it was clear that his flashy lifestyle and disregard for responsibility had become a source of shame. Jackson had deserted his wife, caused a spectacle, and his father could barely look me in the eye. I never lingered at the restaurant after that. Too much tension, too many memories. And, as expected, the exciting new couple started to unravel. The cracks in their relationship showed up sooner than I anticipated. Jackson, as it turned out, was exactly who I thought he was. He drank too much, was lazy, and apparently didn't have a clue what it meant to be in a real relationship. Worse yet, he'd already started chasing after another woman, some younger girl who worked at another one of his father's restaurants. It was around this time that Allison started calling me. At first, it was subtle. Small complaints about Jackson, things that seemed trivial. But gradually, the calls became more frequent and more personal. She lamented about her life and how things weren't what she thought they'd be. "You were my best friend," she said once, her voice breaking slightly over the phone. "I could always talk to you." I stayed calm, though inside it felt like a whirlwind. "That might have been true once," I told her, "but things have changed. You need to work this out with him, not me." There was a pause on the line, and when she responded, I could hear the hurt, the regret. But I stood firm. I couldn't be her emotional crutch anymore. She had made her choice. And then came the night that nearly pushed me over the edge. She had the kids over at her apartment with Jackson for a sleepover, watching movies. It seemed innocent enough, until I got a frantic call from Allison. Jackson had gotten drunk again and was furious that the kids didn't want to watch whatever show he had chosen. My youngest daughter had refused, and in his drunken rage, he slapped her. Hard. I can still remember the way my heart raced when I heard the words. I didn't hesitate. I rushed over, ready to do something I'd regret. But instead, I took the kids and told Jackson, in no uncertain terms, that if I ever heard of him laying a hand on them again, my next call would be to the police. I admit it gave me some grim satisfaction to turn to Allison and say, "And this is what you left me for?" She didn't say a word, just hung her head. For once, I saw real shame in her eyes. Later that night, there was a knock at my door. It was Allison, sobbing, broken. She told me she had left Jackson and wanted to come home. I stood there looking at her, the woman I had loved for years, the mother of my children. Part of me wanted to take her back, to tell her that we could fix this. But after everything that had happened, I knew we couldn't go back to what we once were. "I love you," I told her. "And we have a lot of history. But I can't do this. Too much has happened, and I don't think it's right for you to come back." It was one of the hardest things I'd ever had to say. But deep down, I knew it was the truth. I couldn't just abandon her, though. I let her in, helped her call her parents, and drove her to their house. When we arrived, her father met me at the door. He thanked me, told me I'd always been a good man, a good husband to his daughter. I remember feeling a strange sense of pride in that moment, like I had done the right thing, even though it didn't make the pain any easier to bear. Allison stayed with her parents for about a year after that. Slowly, she started putting her life back together. She got a good job, eventually moved into her own place, and her energy, the spark that I had fallen in love with, returned. It wasn't a perfect situation, but there was a sense of normalcy again, at least for the kids. She was always a good mother, even when everything else fell apart. She dated a few people during that time, but none of the relationships lasted. I think she got taken advantage of more than once, and I could tell it weighed on her. Every so often, she would tell me that I had been the best relationship she ever had, that no one else compared. Maybe it was just cheap talk, but I'd be lying if I said I didn't like hearing it. But that's all it ever was. Words. Nothing romantic ever happened between us again. We kept things cordial, respectful, for the sake of the kids. In the end, I knew I could have been with her again if I wanted to, but I couldn't take that step. Not after everything that had happened. In my heart, I wanted to. But the fear of being hurt again, that was stronger. And so we moved forward in our separate lives. We coexisted, co-parented, and though we would always have our history, I knew some things were best left in the past. During this time, I had dated several women, but nothing ever turned serious. Some of them wanted more, a deeper relationship, even a future together, but I couldn't go there. After what I had been through, I wasn't interested in marriage or anything long-term. I had my kids, my work, and frankly, I had become comfortable with the idea of being on my own. The thought of diving back into something that could bring up old pain just wasn't worth it to me. I figured going solo was the safest route. The years, as they do, passed by quicker than I realized. My kids grew up, went to college, and started their own careers and families. Life, despite its ups and downs, moved forward. My ex-wife, Allison, remained a part of my life, though our interactions were mostly at family events, weddings, birthday parties, and the like. Each time I saw her, she'd ask the same question. Was I seeing anyone? And inevitably, she'd circle back to whether there was still a chance for us to get back together. My answer never changed. No, I would tell her, with a firmness that grew easier to deliver over time. Some things, once they happen, stick with you. You can't just walk away from them. Her face would always fall, that same look of sadness and regret clouding her features. She often admitted to me that leaving me was the worst decision she had ever made. She'd say there wasn't a day that went by where she didn't think about what might have been, about how different life could have turned out. I remember one conversation in particular after a family wedding. She told me that events like these, weddings, birthday parties, and especially funerals, were the hardest for her. The day her parents died, seeing me at their funerals was especially painful because I was there, but not as her husband or her support. She admitted that on days like those, she felt utterly alone, haunted by the choices she made. Allison told me that the weddings of our children had also been bittersweet for her. She said that she had envisioned those days as ones we would share together, as a united front, proud parents. Instead, she stood there watching me from across the room, always reminded of the life she gave up. She asked me once if I ever felt the same way, if I had any regrets about how things had turned out. I was honest with her. Yes, it's sad, I said, but I chose to move forward. I can't dwell on the past. It wouldn't do either of us any good. The irony of her regret was never lost on me. She had been so sure, so confident, that happiness lay with someone else. Now, years later, that decision seemed to weigh heavier on her than anything else. For me, there were moments of sadness, but I had made peace with the past. I wasn't angry anymore. I just didn't feel there was any point in revisiting it. Now, here we are, both of us pushing 60. I had started thinking seriously about retiring, or at least cutting back on work and spending some time somewhere warm, especially during the cold months. My kids were grown, they supported whatever I chose to do, and they still had a close relationship with their mother. But I could sense that the next chapter of my life was approaching. The last significant conversation I had with Allison was at a birthday party for one of our grandchildren. She pulled me aside, asking to speak alone. We stepped outside, and as soon as we did, she became emotional, almost breaking down right in front of me. I hadn't seen her like that in years. She told me that she had always held on to this hope that one day we might get back together. She believed, somewhere in the back of her mind, that there was still a chance for reconciliation. But my talk of moving away, of possibly starting a new life somewhere warmer, made it clear to her that our story, as far as she was concerned, was truly over. "I've spent a lifetime regretting what I did," she said through tears. "I failed as a wife, and I've had to live with that every day." I stood there listening, feeling the weight of her words. There was nothing more to say. Life had moved on for both of us, even if it hadn't for her in the same way. I felt compassion for her, even a little bit of sorrow, but I didn't feel responsible for her regrets. We had both made our choices, and though hers had been more impulsive, we were both living with the consequences. I reached out, gave her a hug, and told her, "We did our best. That's all anyone can ask, but we both have to keep moving forward." That's how I left things with her, that evening and in my heart. It was time to start the next chapter, whatever that would look like, and while the past would always be a part of me, I wasn't going to let it define my future. Life had given me plenty of lessons, some of them hard, some of them bittersweet. But I had learned how to stand on my own, and that was something I was proud of. I told her that so many years had passed, and that she shouldn't carry the weight of regret anymore. I reassured her that I had nothing but respect and admiration for her. Then she asked if she could possibly come visit me. I wasn't sure how to respond, but promised her I would think about it. I'll admit, every time I looked into her beautiful green eyes, my heart would melt. And that day, she looked especially beautiful. The years had been kind to her, and despite everything, in that moment I felt an intense love for her, perhaps even more powerful than I had ever felt before. At this stage in life, I found myself wondering if maybe a relationship with her again wouldn't be such a bad idea. Marriage wasn't something I was considering, but what did I have to lose at this point? She had made me happy once, and if I was being honest with myself, the love I had for her had never truly faded. Maybe, after all these years, we could try again. Update. I've been spending my winters in the Carolinas, and my ex-wife did come to visit. It sounds crazy, I know, but the old feelings came flooding back as if they had never left. She stayed with me at my place, and we spent our time doing all kinds of things together. What was meant to be a weekend visit turned into 2 weeks, and before I knew it, she had stayed for a month. One night, she broke down, sobbing, apologizing for what happened all those years ago. She told me that the past few weeks had brought her so much joy, but they also resurfaced the deep regret she had carried all this time. She admitted to spending years chasing some idealized version of a relationship that didn't exist. I told her the past was the past and maybe it was time for us to move forward. I confessed that my love for her had never died, and I asked her if she would consider staying with me for good. I wasn't interested in marriage again, but at this stage of life, did it really matter? She agreed. In fact, she never left my home after that conversation, and we've been doing great ever since. When we told the kids, their faces were a mix of shock and happiness. My youngest daughter, though, said she wasn't entirely surprised. She always knew I still loved her mother and had a feeling that things weren't truly over between us. Some people might think I'm crazy for giving this relationship another shot after everything we went through. But at this point in our lives, love and respect are what matter most. The mistakes we made decades ago are behind us. Now, when I look at her, I don't feel any anger or resentment, only love. I truly believe the years ahead will be some of our best as we enter this new chapter together. Yes, my wife made a bad decision all those years ago, but that's in the past. We both faced the consequences, but now we're moving forward. I always imagined our life together as a book, one we had started writing long ago. I used to feel sad that we would never get to finish that story. But now, I'm pleased to say we're back on track, and we're writing those final chapters together. Will my wife cheat again? I don't believe she would. Not at this stage in our lives. But one thing age and experience has taught me is that we're all a mix of good and bad. A single action or decision doesn't define a person. I have my own regrets, too. I regret letting my sadness dictate my choices. Maybe I should have recognized sooner that she, like all of us, is human and capable of making mistakes. Perhaps if I had been willing to forgive earlier, things could have turned out differently for us. I also think about the what-ifs, but in the end, I'm grateful for this second chance we've been given. And with that, I'll conclude. I hope my story gives some of you a new perspective to consider.